Good afternoon, because it's now afternoon here at my home, Zara, and welcome to this informal video lesson to help you more effectively to grasp and to appreciate and to otherwise apply constructively to your knowledge, growing knowledge of, and your practical ability to use macroeconomics. Since apparently, because of your busy schedule at your school, you were not able to participate in the originally scheduled fifth macroeconomics lesson of the AP Excellence Macroeconomics course of the first semester. So once again, the lesson plan is rather lengthy because I've combined two original lessons from the school year 2023 to 2024 when I taught this course for the first time. And I have reduced materials from both of those lessons, but I have added towards the end of the lesson a set of materials on the just concluded 2026 edition of the World Economic Forum in the city of Davos in Switzerland, Central Europe. It started this past Monday on January the 19th and concluded yesterday on Friday, January the 23rd, 2026. So let's go quickly through the topics here. So we will have multiple topics: the inflation rate and the price indices, and then the inflation and its relationship with other economic indicators, the causes and costs of inflation, then the relationships between the gross domestic product growth and decline, the business cycle, sustainable development, green economy, and the fair trade. And then, last but not least, there will be selected takeaways from the 2026 World Economic Forum in Davos. So I'll go through the model answers to our old classroom discussion questions and to our old homework assignment. So in number one of the classroom discussion questions, I asked you to compare the two main ways to calculate the gross domestic product, and which way, in your opinion, is probably the more accurate one, and please give your reasons. So those two ways are the expenditure approach and the income approach. The expenditure approach is the most commonly used formula to calculate the gross domestic product, and the formula is GDP equals C plus G plus I plus NX. C stands for the consumption or all private consumer spending within a country's economy, including durable goods, non-durable goods, and services. G signifies the total government expenditures, probably not only the national or the federal government's expenditures, but also the expenditures of the regional, such as provincial or state governments, and of the local governments, including the salaries of government employees, road construction or repair, public schools, and military expenditure. I stands for the sum of a country's investment spent on capital investment or capital equipment, inventories and housing. NX is the acronym or variable for the net exports or country's total exports minus its total imports. Then the income approach that closely resembles the gross national income. So this GDP formula takes the total income generated by the products and services produced inside a country. So it's the total national income plus sales taxes plus depreciation plus net foreign factor income. The total national income is the estimated sum of all wages, salaries, rents, interest, incomes, and profits. Sales taxes refers to the consumer taxes imposed by usually the national or federal government, but sometimes also by the regional governments, or at least many or most of them, on the sales of products and services. Then depreciation means the cost of allocated to a tangible asset over its useful life. We all know that the assets, whether they are vehicles, whether they are machines of various kinds, or even the physical factories and other assets, their values decrease as the time goes on. If the pieces of or sections of land which are owned are well maintained and responsibly cared for, they tend to keep their value, especially in the absence of wars, natural disasters like earthquakes, flash floods, extreme cold, extreme heat, drought, and so forth. Uh, with those qualifiers, the land properties tend to keep their values remarkably long. Then the net foreign factor income refers to the difference between the total income that a country's citizens and companies generate in foreign countries versus the total income that foreign citizens and companies generate in the domestic country. So the income method of calculating the gross domestic product is probably more accurate because it measures more precisely the national economy's overall wealth from the viewpoint of the salaried employees and the entrepreneurs. Then 2A. Why is it important for us to have different types of the gross domestic product? Absolute, nominal, real, nominal per capita, and purchasing power parity per capita. So the absolute gross domestic product is the absolute estimated sum of the values of the products and services produced within a national economy, usually in a given year. And it doesn't take, of course, the country's estimated total population into account. Then the nominal value is the nominal estimated sum of the values of the products and services that have been produced inside a country during a given year, without regarding the inflation rate or the price level. Then the real GDP value takes into account the inflation rate. In other words, the average percentage by which the prices of products and services are rising. And that, of course, is estimated. Nominal per capita, of course, takes the nominal estimated values of the prices of products and services that have been produced in a country and divides it up by the estimated population of the country, typically the so-called mid-year population, so on or around either the end of June or the start of July in that year. And then the purchasing power parity per capita tries to estimate the average price levels, and therefore the rich countries or richer countries of the earth, most European countries, the two gigantic North American countries, Canada and the United States. Then on the Oceanian side, Australia and New Zealand, and then the most prosperous economies of Latin America and the Caribbean, of Africa, of Asia, and of the Middle East. They tend to lose values in the international dollars in their gross domestic product figures. Why? Because those countries on average have comparatively higher price levels than do the developing countries of the earth. Most African and Asian countries, most Oceanian countries, some or several Latin American countries, and Caribbean countries among them. So it's important to have different types of the gross domestic product so that we grasp, in other words, understand sharply, critically, and deeply several different levels and types of the different countries' overall economic growth, prosperity, price levels, and even their income distributions, at least to some extent. We have to be humble enough and realistic enough to admit, as learners of macroeconomics, that it's a very broad concept, very broad social science subject, and none of us can fully understand all of its depths. However, we can progressively grow in understanding them, and of course, in practically applying those aspects to our daily lives, including our economic decisions, from such mundane decisions as which products or services to buy, whether we should use the public transport or private transportation, or whether we should, for example, walk to our schools or to our workplaces or to certain shops or even shopping centers or malls and so forth, or then to visit our loved ones, relatives, friends, neighbors, acquaintances, and so forth. All the way to then uh, um, deciding whether we should buy a house, which of course almost always would mean having a mortgage or house loan or an apartment, or whether we should rent it. Usually the rents tend to be lower or often, especially as far as the houses are concerned, than the mortgages. And then where should we live relative to our places of study and of work? Should we buy a car or another motor vehicle, such as, for example, moped, um, a tricycle, a bicycle, a motorcycle, a jeepney, whatever? And then, should we buy in bulk from such grocery and other products franchises as S&R here in the Philippines, or should we buy from the retail stores? Should we buy in the big shopping centers or malls, or should we buy in the smaller stores, such as, um, for example, the Alpha Mart stores here in Metro Manila? And then, should we buy local products and services? So here in the Philippines, Filipino ones. Or should we buy foreign ones, or perhaps both, and why? And should we canvass, in other words, visit, for example, the websites of different stores, or then physically walk into different stores, for example, in the major shopping centers or malls? Or should we just buy on impulse, or buy in those stores that we like? Or then should we look for the lowest prices, regardless of the quality of different products and also of services? And then, what are certain serious limitations of the gross domestic product as a measure of the economic prosperity? It does not, of course, measure the levels of the wages or salaries in the world's countries if we use the expenditure approach. If we use the income approach, then it does. It does not calculate the levels of the other types of incomes, such as the incomes on the capital gains, profits, interest, investments, inheritance, gifts, online work, gambling, etc., especially if we use the expenditure approach. It does not usually even estimate the monetary value of most types of domestic work or of most types of social and humanitarian work, or the notable value of the gray economy, such as people being informally employed by, for example, their family members, their relatives, friends, acquaintances, neighbors, and so forth, or being self employed, having their own businesses without bothering to have them listed. For example, by visiting the city or town halls or barangay halls here in the Philippines. And then it does not accurately measure or even usually estimate the considerable value of the informal economy. So it includes millions and millions of self employed, privately employed, seasonally employed, and irregularly employed people. So it overlaps with the gray economy. And then it doesn't accurately estimate or measure the lamentably great monetary value of the so called black economy, which is totally illegal. So, that sector of the economy, and tragically, at least most countries, have also variants of the black economy. So, it's run by usually organized criminal groups, including terrorist groups. For example, there are millions of weapons illegally traded online every year. So we shouldn't be greatly surprised if there are so many shootings around the world, not only in the US, by the way, but also globally, because there are so many illegally traded weapons. Of course, a number of shootings, including the fatal ones or partly fatal ones, are made by using such weapons. But there are always a number of shootings that take place by using illegal weapons, illegally acquired weapons. And then the gross domestic product doesn't accurately estimate the depreciation or a decrease in the monetary value of numerous means of production, such as machines and factories, and of many means of distribution, such as motor vehicles and even mobile devices. And then our old homework assignment from last Saturday. 1A, please explain by mentioning some examples what the circular flow means in macroeconomics and why it is a relevant or notably important macroeconomic concept. So it's an economic model that presents how money, products, and services move between different sectors in an economic system. So the flows of money between the sectors are also tracked to measure a country's national income or gross domestic product. So the model is also known as the circular flow of income. So it describes how money and economic resources flow in cycles between different sectors in an economic system. In the basic or two-factor circular flow model, money flows from households to businesses because consumer expenditures in exchange for products and services produced by the businesses um, are involved, and then money flows back from businesses to households for the labor that individuals provide. But of course, we know that there are other economic actors and entities in operation. Uh, there are the different levels of government, all the way from the local ones to the supranational ones, then the foreign sector, or rather sectors, and the financial sectors. So, in macroeconomics, in the broad sense of the word, for example, the following types of the circular flow exist: the circular flows of money, capital, income, expenditures, sales, profits, investments, labor force, economic growth, supply, demand, consumer confidence, and business confidence. So, why does the circular flow matter so much in macroeconomics? Because it emphasizes the high degree of interaction in the global economy, also the elevated degree of interdependence in the global economy, and then the detailed and many sided or intricate and multifaceted nature of the global economy. And then, because it tells us always to remember the fluid characteristics of the global economy. In other words, the global economy, if we're accurate and precise enough, it's changing all the time to a greater or lesser degree. And then, because it underscores or emphasizes the fact that the local, national, regional, continental, and especially the global economies never are at a standstill. So they are always changing. They are either progressing, going forward, or regressing, in other words, going backward. They are growing or declining. They are becoming stronger, or they are becoming weaker. And then 1B, please compare and contrast the several types of unemployment and then discuss the top 3 or 4 ways to effectively reduce unemployment. So, in addition, please remember to justify or give some reasons for your answer to the second part of this question. So, the types of unemployment, for example, cyclical unemployment, so typically it falls during the periods of economic growth, especially during the quickest periods of economic growth known as the booms. Then it starts to decline. I'm sorry. Then it starts to rise during the periods of economic slowdown when the economies are still growing, but they are growing at reduced rates. And then, of course, unemployment considerably rises during the periods of recession and especially of depression. Recession is when the economies are moderately declining, especially in the inflation adjusted terms. And then the depression means when the economies are more or less in a free fall. They are declining by at least 5 to 10% per year in the GDP figures when adjusted for inflation. Then there is the frictional unemployment, so people are between jobs. The frictional unemployment tends to be brief, it tends to last less than 1 year at most. In certain ways, it can last only a matter of days. In certain cases, it can only last a matter of days or weeks. And usually, the frictional unemployment, especially for those people who are financially secure and who have either by their educational degrees or by their work experiences or by both, they have already earned so high credentials that they can afford technically to be briefly unemployed because they always will have employment. Think about, for example, the information technology professionals, the artificial intelligence professionals, those educators who have master's degrees or even doctoral degrees in education, and similar professionals in, for example, research and development, in economics, in different other sciences, and so forth, let alone the managerial level people, especially the chief executive officers or chief operating officers or the managing directors of different businesses, companies, and corporations. Then structural unemployment is caused by the deep and long lasting changes or transformations of the economies, by the increasing outflow of businesses and therefore of jobs, especially from the primary sectors of the economy, agriculture, forestry, and fishing, but increasingly also from the traditional manufacturing or industrial sectors of the economies into the service and digital sectors of the economies, which means that a growing number of the members of the workforces have, to some extent, outdated educational degrees and courses, outdated work experiences, and even outdated skills. Then natural unemployment is the combination of frictional and structural unemployment. Then long-term unemployment means usually that people have been unemployed just about constantly, aside from maybe some temporary odd jobs and so forth, and volunteer work for at least 1 year or longer. And then the longer is this unemployment, especially if people are years and years outside the regular workforce, the more likely they are to decline in their skills, decline also in their motivations for applying for work, and decline in their hopes of finding work. And then they have growing risks to turn to more or less illegal forms of earning a living, including, for example, gambling and trade in stolen products, smuggled products, trade in illegally acquired and distributed alcohol, tobacco, and tragically even drugs and/or weapons. That's why so many countries, and especially members of the third sector of the economy and of the society, non governmental organizations, are trying hard to reach out to these long term unemployed people, to establish workshops, formal and informal ones, and somewhere in between for them, and to give them at least part time employment in various non governmental organizations. At the very least, voluntary employment, but preferably even employment from which they can earn some livable levels of wages and or salaries. And then there's seasonal unemployment. This is typical, especially in the tourism, entertainment, and construction industries, among others. And classical unemployment, it means that the real wages or inflation adjusted wages or the cost of employing workers are too high. And therefore, the companies, in order to remain in business somehow, will have to reduce their workforce. Then there's underemployment, which means either working too few hours per week or too irregularly per week, or then earning too low salaries and or wages per week in order to make ends meet without the help of other people, such as immediate family or household members. So we should, for example, make sure that our motives for seeking work are correct and that our educational degrees and or work experiences are appropriate or sufficient, that our curriculum vitae or resumes, in other words, our summaries of personal details, educational work experience, abilities, and special skills are up to date and appealing enough. And that we are seeking the types of work which allow us to contribute maximally or sufficiently to those particular businesses or companies where we would like to work and to the overall economy. And that we are convincing and persuasive enough in the job applications and interviews, and that we learn once hired the rules, regulations, policies, and expectations of the businesses or the companies quickly enough. And that we are as timely and punctual as possible in reporting to work, in performing it, and in signing out of work daily. And that we are always willing to try our best while working. So the above ways try to ensure that the maximum number of the job seekers and of the employees are fully committed to find work, to perform their work as well as possible, and to keep developing steadily as workers and as productive and valuable members of the global workforce. So these are the topics for this asynchronous lesson. We're going to define and describe the inflation rate and the price indices as economic indicators. We're going to explore the causes and costs of the inflation rate and the relationships of the inflation rate with various other economic indicators. Then we're going to examine the relationships between the GDP growth or decline and the business cycles, and the relationships between the GDP growth or decline and the sustainable development, green economy, and the fair trade movement. And then we're going to suggest reasonable strategies to achieve a long-term balanced and environmentally friendly economic growth, and then to reflect on or think carefully, deeply, and critically about the major outcomes or results of the just concluded 2026 World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. And our expected learning outcomes for this asynchronous lesson, so that you will grasp, in other words, understand deeply and sharply and constructively and logically and critically and appreciate the inflation rate and the price indices as economic indicators, and will understand the economic importance of these or those economic measurements. And then that you will carefully and critically ponder or think carefully and deeply about the causes and effects of the inflation rate and the links of the inflation rate to multiple other economic indicators. And then that you will carefully and critically analyze the links between the GDP growth or decline and the various stages of the business cycles, and between the sustainable development, green economy, and the fair trade movement. And then that you will thoughtfully and well informedly propose clever ways to reach the ideal of a long term, steady, and environmentally sound economic growth, and that you will carefully and critically evaluate the wider results of the 2026 World Economic Forum in Davos. So most of the video links and of the other website links, they come from the um, 2023 to 24 school year, but I've added two to both lists. So they deal with the just concluded Davos World Economic Forum. So now please excuse me for a few minutes. I'll get some accessories from downstairs, but I'll be back in a few minutes. Okay, I'm back. So I'm trying to read the lesson plan without my eyeglasses. That's why I have to, due to my less than perfect eyesight, going to have to lean quite close to the screen. So the inflation rate basically means the estimated average rise in the price levels of the products and services. Of course, it's never a perfect estimate. While estimating the inflation rate, the economists use various so-called market baskets of the commonly purchased or bought products and services. There are different price indices, especially the consumer price index, that are used to calculate in an estimated way the official inflation rate of a country or a smaller political and economic area, such as a province, a federal state, or even a metropolitan area. So the inflation rate, as an economic indicator, it tells us by what percentage or by what fraction of a percentage the prices have on average increased, usually during the past 12 months or 1 year, 3 months or a quarter, or even 1 month of measurement. And to some extent, it tells us whether the country's or other political and economic areas' economy is growing steadily, growing more quickly, growing more slowly, not growing at all, or getting smaller. So normally the inflation rate tends to rise if the country's economy grows quickly. So its gross domestic product, when adjusted for inflation, is rising at an annual rate of at least 3 to 5%. And then it also tends to rise, the inflation rate, I mean, if the consumer's average demand increases more quickly than the producer's average ability to raise the supply of many or most products and services. And obviously, the consumers are more likely to spend more money on products and services when they are, for example, getting paid higher salaries, wages, and other forms of income, and also when they are more confident about their economic prosperity. Or, for example, when there are big discount or sales times. For example, in the last months of the year in many countries, especially in November and December, And then there can be other sales periods, for example, around March and April, around June and July as well. And then those consumers uh, who want to take advantage of rather radical price decreases, especially when certain businesses or stores are closing, there may be discounts of 50% or even more. For example, during my recent visit to my distant native land, Finland, I noticed in that city where we spent those 2 weeks in southeastern Finland that one clothing store was closing and therefore its items were being sold at a 50% discount. So, of course, we should understand that the inflation rate also normally rises if the consumer's average demand also rises, and then the average supply remains largely the same or even falls. And then, when the economy is recovering from the recession, or especially from the depression, the inflation rate also starts to rise, and sometimes its rise is rather quick, even over 5% per year, because so many consumers start to spend a lot more money on many products and services again. Many or most businesses start again to hire many new employees and to rehire multiple laid off employees. Many or most investors start again to invest in different sectors of the economy. Many or most banks and other lending companies again lower their interest rates, and then the inflation rate usually starts to fall when the economy begins to slow down because the unemployment rate begins to rise again. The rates of business failures and bankruptcies and receiverships, they start to rise again. Um, the banks and other lending companies start calling in their loans because they are losing money. And then more businesses start to terminate or fire and to lay off, place on temporary holiday from work their employees. And then more people and businesses, of course, start spending and borrowing less. And then more banks and other lending companies start to tighten their lending policies. So they can, for example, take assets such as houses, apartments, and or cars and other motor vehicles from the borrowers or debtors who refuse to repay or who cannot repay their loans on time. And then more governments tend to reduce their non-essential or discretionary spending, and the business confidence and consumer confidence in the economy's um, short-term prospects especially begin to worsen. And then more economists, other economic experts, such as financial analysts and government officials, start to publish more pessimistic predictions or scenarios about the economy. And then more investors begin to reduce and or to cancel their investments. And then during the recession, the inflation rate normally falls even more because even more people lose their jobs, even more employees are forced to or choose to work part time or irregularly, even more businesses terminate and lay off their employees, even more people and businesses begin to reduce their spending and borrowing. And even more banks and other lending companies start to tighten their lending policies. Even more governments tend to reduce their non essential or discretionary spending, and the business confidence and consumer confidence decline even further. And then even more economists, other economic experts, and government officials start to publish more pessimistic predictions or scenarios about the economy, and even more investors begin to reduce and or to cancel their investments. And occasionally during the recession, and especially if it deepens into an even more radical and even more rapid or quick decline in the inflation adjusted value of the GDP, the inflation can reach zero or even become negative. In other words, the average levels of the prices of products and services start to decline. So, this is usually the sign that the economy has hit basically the rock bottom because the demand is just about as low as it can get. And only relatively few governments in such situations can afford to or dare to massively reduce their taxes or massively increase their spending. And only relatively few economists, other economic experts, or government officials choose or dare to make notably optimistic predictions about the country's economic future. Then let's move to our next topic. What are the price indices and what kinds of economic indicators are they? So they are measures of how prices change over a period of time. For example, month to month, every 3 months or every quarter, every 6 months or half year, and most typically every year, so year on year. So, for example, in February 2026, the latest inflation figures will indicate usually by what levels the prices have increased or decreased, usually increased, of course, on a year on year basis. That is from January 2025 to January 2026, here in the Philippines, in the rest of Asia, and globally, especially on the six regularly inhabited continents of the Earth: Asia, Oceania, Africa, Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean region, and North America. So there are multiple methods on how to calculate inflation or deflation. So the general formula for the price index is the following: PI 1, 2 equals F, and then in brackets P1, P2, and X, where PI 1, 2 is some price index that measures the change in price from period 1 to period 2, usually from that month of the previous calendar year to this particular month in the current calendar year. P1, price of goods in period 1, goods means products. P2, price of products in period 2. X, weights, the weights are used in conjunction with the prices, and F, general function. So just like the other economic indicators, also the price indices are imperfect because they do not measure the prices of all products and services. They don't always measure the effects of all sales, in other words, temporary reductions of the prices of products and services. They do not accurately measure the prices of all small businesses or online businesses, or of all disruptions in the supply chains, or the prices of the products and services, or the effects of all disruptions in the distribution chains on the prices of the products and services, or the inflation rates of all luxury goods and services, or the inflation rates of all small and moderately sold and consumed products and services, let alone of the products and services which are bought and sold in the gray, informal, and dark or black economies. So, although the inflation rate and the price indices are, of course, valuable economic measurements and indicators, they are never totally precise. Always, they are rather more or less approximations and estimates. So, they tell us in which directions the average levels of the prices of most regularly bought and consumed products and services of the official, that is, legal economic sectors are going up, down, or unchanged. And then the latter alternative is rare. And then I have compiled a list of the estimated recent inflation rates around the world. It comes from the https://tradingeconomies.com website. So these estimates are from October, November, and December for the most part of the recently ended year 2025. There are some from July or even June or September. And then, of course, there are the global estimates of the inflation rates. So the inflation rate is calculated by using, first and foremost, the consumer price index. So the products and average and services which are most regularly bought form this hypothetical basket of products and services. So they include, for example, milk, cereal, and coffee, transportation expenses such as the bus, train, subway, and other fares, the cost of housing, such as the rents and mortgages, clothing, recreational expenses, such as going to concerts, toys, furniture, such as tables and chairs and desks of different kinds, and sofas or couches, haircuts, tobacco and medical expenses. So information is gathered, then charts are completed with information, consumer price index information. The time periods are determined, and then the consumer price indices for earlier dates are located. Then the consumer price indices are named or identified for later dates, and then the inflation rate formula is used. So those economists who specialize in such calculations, and for example, government employees, especially at the federal or national levels, they subtract the past date consumer price index from the current date consumer price index, and then divide their answers by the past date consumer price index, and then they multiply the results by 100. So that's how they get the as the final result of those calculations the inflation rate as a percentage. So below is an additional online article about the causes of or reasons for the inflation rate. So demand pull, cost push, and inflation expectations. So what do they mean? Demand pull inflation happens when the total demand for products and services is greater than the economy's ability to supply them and pulls prices up. So, for example, a sudden surge in consumer spending after a lockdown. Then the cost push inflation happens when the cost to produce products rises, forcing businesses to increase prices. Caused by, for example, higher raw material costs like oil, especially crude oil, increased wages and salaries, supply chain disruptions, or taxes. And then the built in inflation or inflation expectations, a cycle where workers expect prices to rise, demanding higher wages, which leads businesses to raise prices further, creating a self reinforcing loop or the wage price spiral. And then there are other factors such as fiscal policies, government, especially once again national or federal government spending, and tax policies can influence overall demand. Monetary policies, so excessive increases in the money supply by central banks, tends to devalue currency, in other words, lower its value relative to those of various other countries' currencies or official monies or money units, and then to raise spending power, driving up prices. Then currency devaluation, where either the central bank or the government or both, so usually the national or federal government, lowers in order to temporarily stimulate demand and to make the exports of the country more affordable. Um, uh, the outward value of that country's currency relative to the other freely traded currencies. And this is done especially to increase the chances of that country to compete, at least on a short term basis, against its key competitors, such as several neighboring or nearby countries, although not only them. So, weaker currency makes imports more expensive, and therefore that raises inflation. And then supply shocks. So, for example, various kinds of armed conflicts, all the way from all out wars to regional skirmishes, then natural disasters such as flash floods, major droughts, unseasonably high or low temperatures, and earthquakes can disrupt, and then huge storms, which have become, especially since the 1970s or the 1980s, considerably more common across the earth. can disrupt supplies or supply chains and raise commodity prices. Then the costs of inflation. So they hurt especially the lower income people, particularly those who have no income because they are either too young or too old to earn. So children and young teenagers or retired people. And then people on fixed and low incomes, especially low income pensioners and students. Then people who are at least temporarily unable to work because of physical disability and or emotional issues and so forth. And then people who have lost their jobs for whatever reasons, or then because of, for example, family reasons or discouragement and so far have quit their jobs. And then those who are irregularly employed or underemployed, the working poor, in other words, the people who can have even full time jobs, but at such low salaries or wages that they basically live from hand to mouth with little money only being saved per month, or not at all. Poor farmers as well. And then inflation rate tends to cause more employees to demand, of course, higher wages and salaries, which often then causes strikes and or walkouts and or threats of strikes. And then if many employers agree to their unionized employees' demands for higher wages and salaries, sooner or later they will have to raise the prices of their products and services to be able to earn high enough sales and profits. And then this cycle continues over and over again. The inflation rate also affects the prices of the raw materials on which many businesses still depend, and then that tends to push up the prices of the supply and distribution processes, which in turn sooner or later causes many supply and distribution workers to demand higher wages and salaries, and so forth. And then here are 10 suggested ways to struggle successfully against inflation. None of them, of course, is perfect. Increase the labor force, which then would imply, especially in the countries of low natural population growth or none at all, to make it easier, especially for the highly skilled and motivated workers to move in from abroad, and then to try to attract expatriate workers back. Then to make supply chains easier, to tighten fiscal policy to reduce tariffs or even selectively eliminate them, then to produce more products at home or nationally, lower energy prices, increase farm production, fund short term incentives for truck drivers and warehouse workers to try to end the trade wars. A noble goal, but difficult to meet in today's world, but a worthy goal to pursue. Then to invest in housing and to build new houses. And then to move into our next topic, why is the growth of the gross domestic product desirable in the long run? Because it tends to produce higher average incomes, to lower unemployment, to lower government borrowing, to improve public services, and then to help ordinary people like consumers and workers, um, businesses, the third sector organizations like the non-governmental organizations, and the governments of different levels to spend money on protecting the environment more effectively. It tends to boost investment, both public and private investment, both domestic and foreign one. It tends to increase the funds for and the motives for research and development. It tends to boost economic development, tends to give the governments, businesses, including business owners and consumers and workers, more choices. And then it tends to reduce the absolute poverty rate. In other words, the rate of people who have few or no effective financial or material resources. But then, by contrast, which factors limit and often prevent the constant growth of the gross domestic product? Well, to start off, the economies have scarce human resources. In other words, only a limited number of employees and potential employees. Scarce raw materials, scarce inventive and innovative resources. They grow erratically, not steadily, unevenly, and lamentably often through over borrowing, overspending, over investing, over marketing, over promoting, and over advertising. In other words, those basically where the economic activities are practiced excessively from time to time. And no economy or economic system has fully been able to solve these problems. However, all should try to solve them to the greatest degrees possible. And then, now in the 2020s, the economies are increasingly globalized, dependent on each other, or interdependent and integrated. So they often experience widespread and quickly expanding slowdowns and recessions. Then, next, how do the multiple phases or parts of the business cycle affect the growth of the gross domestic product? When the economies are recovering, the gross domestic product starts to grow again, at first slowly and then gradually more quickly. Then, during the periods of the fastest economic growth or boom, the gross domestic product grows quickly, at least by between 3% and 5% per year, even when adjusted for inflation. And then during the economic slowdown or downturn, the gross domestic product starts to grow more slowly, especially when adjusted for inflation, and eventually it reaches the stagnation point of little or no growth in the real or inflation adjusted terms. And during the economic recession, the gross domestic product starts to decrease at least moderately by fractions of 1% or by between, let's say, 1.3% per year, once again when adjusted for inflation. And then during the economic depression, the gross domestic product decreases or falls quickly, at least by 4 to 5% per year, often even more quickly, and even when adjusted for inflation. So, to move into our next topic, what is the sustainable development? Excuse me. And how is it linked to the growth of the gross domestic product? So, it's the effort to achieve economic growth that seeks to achieve the following goals: to reduce the burdens of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas on the earth, to slow down the environmental pollution, to preserve the earth's biodiversity, the multiple plant and animal and bird species, and then, of course, the aquatic species like fish of various kinds alive. Then, to try to slow down or to stop the pollution of the earth's bodies of water, all the way from the small creeks and rivers and ponds and lakes to the vast oceans and to the longest rivers, such as the Amazon River in South America and the Nile River in northeastern and eastern Africa. And then here in Asia, for example, the long Indus and Ganges rivers of the Indian subcontinent in southern Asia. And then tries to slow down or to stop the pollution of the earth's soils, especially the pollution of the farmlands, meadows, pastures, and forest soils. And then, because of what reasons, beliefs, or expectations, do quite many people consider the sustainable development a fine ideal, fine dream, which is in practice difficult to reach? Because those people agree that we all should do much more to protect this fragile and precious planet Earth and its environment. Sadly, they conclude that the human nature, especially its selfish and acquisitive and competitive and jealous flaws, make it difficult in practice to achieve consistently the ideals of sustainable development and especially to hold on to them globally. Then, unfortunately, more people are willing to keep consuming environmentally harmful products than to start and continue consuming environmentally friendly products. And unfortunately, more businesses still are producing ecologically polluting products than ecologically friendly products. And unfortunately, a clear or great majority of the world's motor vehicles, mopeds, motorcycles, uh, jeepneys, tricycles, buses, transport trucks, and trucks of other kinds, and cars, and even helicopters and airplanes and drones still use the environmentally harmful fuels, such as the kerosene, diesel, and gasoline. And despite all the sincere efforts and educational programs, most people of the world are still not regularly recycling their waste. And the most medium sized and big businesses, and quite many smaller businesses, are still more or less deliberately polluting the Earth's soils, bodies of water, and atmosphere. But let's not be too gloomy. Why do a growing number of people believe that we must at least try harder to achieve and to maintain the sustainable development in the long run? Well, because they sincerely feel or believe that it is our duty to at least try to save this planet Earth from its impending ecological catastrophe. And that even the small steps towards the sustainable development, such as walking or biking more, eating less meat and more fruits and vegetables, recycling more, and buying more organic foods, will help the Earth to survive and to remain livable for a long time. They also point out that there are a growing number of ecologically living and farming people and communities. There are also an increasing number of green or environmentally friendlier businesses and organic farms. And then they remind the skeptics or doubters and the cynics or mocking people that a growing number of countries are adopting and putting into practice or implementing ecologically friendlier laws and policies. And in what ways are the sustainable development and the ongoing environmental pollution linked to each other? Well, clean air is among the long term sustainable development goals or SDGs. And in a similar vein, the SDGs try to transform or change deeply and hopefully on a permanent basis the human uses of the soils and bodies of water. Many environmental activists are trying to clean up at least a portion of the polluted soils. Many activists are also trying to clean up at least a part of the polluted bodies of water. And many countries are tightening and more strictly enforcing their anti emission laws. Emissions mean harmful gases which are released into the atmosphere by various types of businesses and vehicles and so forth. So, the green economy and its connections to the GDP growth. The green economy is the economy that tries to maximize the use of organic raw materials, of recycled raw materials, of ecological products, and also to maximize the ecologically friendly production processes, and that seeks to moderate ecologically sound, balanced, social and globally fair and inclusive and long-term GDP growth. And then by comparison, the fair trade movement and its links to the GDP growth. So it tries to increase the poor African, Asian, Latin American, including Caribbean, and native Oceanian farmers' incomes by paying them fairer wages and salaries. It tries to increase the number of organic and pro ecological farms and the number of female owned farms because women are more likely on average than men to try to produce more ecologically. And then also the number of organic fruits and vegetables. And then it tries to ultimately eliminate the use of child labor, especially the labor of children and teenagers who are under 15 years or even under 10 years of age. Slave and other involuntary labor, which are tragic and shameful examples of the lingering 21st century slavery. And by a fairly recent estimate of the United Nations published in September 2022, or not even yet quite 3.5 years ago, there were some 50 million modern slaves. So, this, of course, is an estimate. The real number could be higher or perhaps lower. And underpaid and unpaid labor from the developing countries' farms. So, there are many ways in which the world can hopefully in the future achieve a long term, balanced, and environmentally sustainable economic growth. So, in growth, we include the ambition of increased prosperity and well being, including economic profit growth for companies, GDP growth for nations, derived in part from dignity of work, while recognizing that measurable definitions of well being, of course, are still fluid. In inclusion, we consider equality of opportunity and broad based progressive outcomes for all, and the narrowing of inequalities among genders, ages, ethnicities, family backgrounds, and places of residence. In sustainability, we aim for environmental resilience, which starts with reducing climate risk, but also includes much broader preservation of natural capital as well as intergenerational fairness, which are all considered in terms of economic and societal costs and benefits. So, growth supports inclusion, creating meaningful jobs and lifting incomes, correcting labor market inadequacies. Growth enables sustainability by encouraging investment. Greater inclusion and sustainability promote growth through new demand and investment opportunities. Sustainability reinforces both inclusion and growth through the energy price. And then, 7 ways to be more ecologically friendly. Use the LED lighting throughout your home. I have to then look up that term. Yeah, light emitting diode. So, semiconductor device that produces light when an electric current passes through it, making it highly energy efficient, versatile, and long lasting lighting technology used in everything from indicator lights to modern home bulbs. So, unlike incandescent bulbs, LEDs don't have filaments. They work by passing current through a microchip which illuminates tiny light sources, and they use heat sinks to manage heat, allowing them to be more durable and directional. So I have to include that definition in my lesson plan. And then use more public transport, including buses, and here in the Philippines, for example, tricycles, shuttles, and so forth. Wash your clothes less often, eat less meat. Limit your travel by airplane because airplanes sadly are still among the major polluting vehicles. Change your pension suppliers and then invest in electronic devices instead of paper. So, the World Economic Forum, what does it mean? Why does it matter? And then what should we know, remember, and reflect on, or think carefully, critically, and deeply, and hopefully constructively about the just ended 2026 edition of the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, Central Europe. So, the World Economic Forum is a Swiss based non-profit international organization Switzerland is, by the way, still officially a neutral country. It only joined the United Nations. I'll have to look this up, sorry. This is additional information, of course. In 2002. There was a direct vote by the eligible or adult Swiss citizens. Of course, the turnout probably was low. By a popular vote in March 2002, and then Switzerland at last became a member state of the United Nations in September 2002. So the irony was that Switzerland actually had been the site via Geneva, of course, or Genève in French, Genf in German, of the main predecessor organization of the United Nations, the League of Nations, or La Société des Nations in French. And then I'll have to look this up again. So the headquarters of the following UN organizations are in Geneva. So the World Health Organization, the International Labour Organization, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the World Trade Organization, and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, and then WIPO, World Intellectual Property Organization. However, the headquarters of the United Nations Children's Fund, or UNICEF, are located in New York City, United States. I had the mistaken impression until this Google search that they would have been located in Geneva. But that's it. So, established by Klaus Schwab, dedicated to improving the state of the world through public-private cooperation. So the World Economic Forum does matter because it acts as an intermediary, making it easier to collaborate or cooperate between the private sector or business leaders, also the so-called third sector, such as the non-governmental organization, such as many non-governmental organizations. And then the public sector, governments, especially national, federal, and supranational ones, trying to create solutions for global issues. So it tries to be not just a discussion forum, but also a forum to propose reasonable and globally relevant and hopefully sustainable solutions. And then it tries to address global challenges, such as economic growth, technology, especially the growing impacts and controversial impacts of artificial intelligence, and environmental sustainability, such as resistance to the climate change. And then it includes participants from several continents and regions. So every year, at least from the following continents and regions: Asia, and the partly overlapping Middle East, Oceania, Africa, Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean region, and North America, and according to my estimate, at least occasionally even from the Arctic, from the northernmost regions of especially Europe and North America, and perhaps even of Asia. And then stakeholder theory. It operates on the belief that organizations are accountable to all parts of society, not just to the businesses and governments, and it tries to concentrate on long term sustainability rather than just shareholder value. And it's also one of the key forums globally for dialogue and research. So, through its 11 centers and numerous specialized meetings, the World Economic Forum provides research backed or based insights on such topics as the energy transition, digital trust, and skills development. And also, it's a form of major global influence. So, the Davos meeting, which is held every January, is highly influential and it gives a forum to discuss or um, a place to discuss both in person and virtually, networking, geopolitical tensions such as wars and tariff um, issues, and forming policies that often shape the global economic agenda for that year. So, according to the World Economic Forum's website, https colon slash slash www.weforum.org, there are 10 insights. This uh, post is from January the 23rd, 2026, when this year's edition of the World Economic Forum came into close. So tensions rose and decreased. The Greenland tariffs were dropped. US President Donald Trump had a meeting with the Secretary General of the US led, ironically enough, a defensive and military alliance, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a great majority of whose member states are in Europe. Mark Rutte, a former longtime Dutch prime minister. And then Trump appeared to back away from his threat to even forcibly, if necessary, annex Greenland, which is a large Arctic island located on the northeastern coast of North America, to the northeast of Canada's main territory, by the way. Then, according to this contributor, there was a structural shift for trade rules. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, who delivered a roughly 30-minute speech, declared, for example, and I quote him, "Let me be direct, we are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition." Rupture means a break or breach. "We have a recognition of what's happening and a determination to act accordingly. We understand that this rupture calls for more than adaptation, it calls for honesty about the world as it is." For her part, the Bulgarian born managing director of the International Monetary Forum, Bulgaria is a small country in the on the Balkan Peninsula of southeastern Europe. Miss or Mrs. Kristalina Georgieva commented, and I quote her, "We have always traded and we will always trade. Trade is like a river water. You put an obstacle, it goes around it." So she sounded a more optimistic note than Prime Minister Carney. Then geopolitical complexity, as the third takeaway, is speeding up trade deals. A freshly signed trade deal or free trade deal between the European Union, which is the economic, political, and largely or partly military organization, where 26 European countries and one Asian country, the Greek Republic of Cyprus, belong. And then Mercosur, or the South American Common Market, which has 4 full member states: Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay, and several associate members. highlighted how economies are seeking new forms of cooperation. In Davos, the European Commission president and the highest political leader of the European Union, the German born Ursula von der Leyen, hinted at the mother of all deals around the corner between the European Union and India. Then, fourthly, industrial policy is on the agenda and on the rise. New government interventions in the economy were 262% higher in 2025 than they had been in 2019. So the increase had been driven by economic security, employment, technology, and sustainability considerations. So this, despite the multiple, even tens of armed conflicts around the world, and despite the ongoing pandemic, COVID-19. So leaders in Davos noted that while industrial policy is increasingly needed, negative spillover effects and distortions are unchecked. And then diversify, diversify, diversify. So in an era of shifting alliances, the most resilient strategy is to diversify, as over-reliance on one partner is a vulnerability. So if I remember correctly, Nigerian-born Director General Ms. or Mrs. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala of the World Trade Organization cautioned that countries need to better manage their dependencies and must ensure trade diversity. So trade in multiple forms, including online trade. While then the Indonesian president, Prabowo Subianto, affirmed that trade integration, when it is done fairly, is not a threat to national security, but rather a tool for economic prosperity. And then sixthly, are critical minerals the new oil? Because, for example, the global reserves for oil, unless something dramatic happens in terms of the consumption patterns, or unless notably large new sources are found, or then the ability to exploit the oil reserves up in the Arctic, for example, is greatly increased, the oil reserves will run out sometime later during the 21st century. So critical minerals are driving a global scramble for materials. Boitumelo Mosako, the CEO of the Development Bank of Southern Africa, highlighted that global partnership has supported the development of the Lobito corridor. I have to make some corrections to the lesson plan, which runs through Angola, a country on the southwestern African coast, the Democratic Republic of Congo in Central Africa, and Zambia in Southern Africa, and is an important transport route for copper and cobalt. The forum is expanding its efforts on critical minerals, dialogue in collaboration with Saudi Arabia. And then seventhly, trade tensions have not affected services yet, which is surprising to some extent. So the global services trade includes the global digital economy, tourism, and online services, among others. Then the technology trade paradox. So digital tools can make trade faster and cheaper despite the tariffs. Artificial intelligence, digitalization, so going increasingly online in economic activities like buying, selling, marketing, advertising, and so forth. And data-driven systems can act as powerful equalizers, especially for the small and medium-sized enterprises or SMEs and middle economies. Then trade facilitation for resilience. So participants recognized making trade easier, that's what facilitation means in terms of trade, as a strategic tool for resilience when faced with fragmentation and supply chain shocks, for the mispronunciation. So having recently celebrated its 10th anniversary, the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation's mission remains as relevant, if not more, today than it was 10 years ago. Furthermore, security added, was added to the trade priority lists. So, security planning featured across many discussions. Supply chain leaders recognized the need for risk management and scenario building to ensure system readiness. Tariff changes can be disruptive, but they are clear. Businesses are far less certain about how national security is now being applied to the economy or economies and are asking for more clarity on what it exactly means and includes. Then another viewpoint from the website https colon slash slash www.linkedin.com slash pulse slash and so forth. So these contributors' top 10 insights from the World Economic Forum in Davos 2026 included that, first of all, that the artificial intelligence innovation must come from the chief executive officers. So in a fireside chat on rewiring the global economy, Eric Schmidt and David M. Rubenstein were remarkably agreeing on one point: artificial innovation cannot be delegated. So its real impact, according to them, only happens when chief executive officers of different corporations personally own the agenda, align artificial intelligence with core business practices, and rewire operating models end to end. However, it cannot only depend on them. There must be many other people involved as well. So, in my humble opinion, that's a rather elitist view with which I cannot sincerely or fully agree. But we move on. Then, secondly, artificial intelligence has become economic infrastructure. So it already contributes over 1% of United States gross domestic product. It would be wonderful to find out the source for that claim or sources, and how about globally. Hyperscalers now require between 1 and 10 gigawatts of power each, and the US alone will need roughly 80 gigawatts of additional capacity within the next 3 to 5 years. Then artificial intelligence as a new species: power, identity, and control. So, in this contributor's opinion or commentator's opinion, one of the most intellectually challenging sessions during the just concluded World Economic Forum in Davos featured Yuval Noah Harari, Max Tegmark, and Francine Lacroix. Many experts now estimate that superintelligence within 1 to 10 years will emerge. Harari described artificial intelligence as increasingly meeting the definition of a new species, which then raises uh, questions of deep potential concern. How do societies adapt to artificial intelligence immigration into healthcare, education, and finance? How do we regulate systems that humans may not fully understand? And how do we preserve human agency? Then, fourthly, sustainability is almost purpose or about purpose, sorry, not optics. So, in a powerful sustainability discussion, Matt Damon, Gary White, Esther Beger, Ramon Laguarta, and Varun Sivaram reframed sustainability as a systems challenge rather than a branding exercise. So, through the work of water.org and the Brave Blue World Foundation, it became clear that innovation without purpose does not scale socially, politically, or economically. Then, fifthly, energy is the hard constraint beneath artificial intelligence and industry. So, a reality check came from Marcus Kreber, CEO of RWE, who emphasized that artificial intelligence, electrification, and high and industrial transformation are fundamentally energy stories. Energy infrastructure operates on 15 to 20-year horizons, according to this claim, which then makes policy volatility one of the biggest risks to future competitiveness. Then, sixthly, Europe can win in industrial artificial intelligence if it acts now. So, from an industrial perspective, Cedric Neike of Siemens made a compelling case for Europe's artificial intelligence opportunity. So, Europe holds a unique advantage in industry, although the US, at least, still dominates consumer artificial industry. Yet 80 to 90% of industrial data remains unused. So there can be potentially annual productivity gains over the next 5 to 10 years of between 7% and 10%. And they can be achieved through full transformation rather than isolated pilots. Seventhly, capital is the missing link in Europe's artificial intelligence ambitions. So, in a frank or sincere session, Bettina Orlop, the CEO of Commerzbank or Business Bank AG, based in Germany, based on its name, I think, highlighted that Europe does not lack savings. What it needs is effective capital market mobilization. Then, eighthly, agentic artificial intelligence works when it is put into production. So, practical evidence came from a session with Ruba Borno of Amazon Web Services or AWS, Brian Harris of SAS, Scandinavian Airline System, I believe, which is the joint national airline and regional airline of Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, and Mandeep Singh of CFA Bloomberg Intelligence. So examples included 99% of hallucination reduction in healthcare can be achieved by using automated reasoning. And then $1 billion in value is created in 1 year at Toyota through multi-agent optimization. So in conclusion, the biggest obstacles are not models or data, but trust, governance, and change management. And then ninthly, artificial intelligence is rewriting the logic of M and A. In discussions with Eva Scherer, Dagmar Mundani, Alexander Meyer, and Holger Kneisel, it became clear that artificial intelligence is fundamentally changing deal logic. Yeah, I'll have to find out what M and A means. Mergers and acquisitions, okay. So mergers mean the unions, whether forced or voluntary ones, or a bit of both, between businesses. Often small businesses and or businesses that are losing money in order to avoid the humiliation of bankruptcy merge with other businesses or unite. So premiums only hold when artificial intelligence is deeply integrated into the operating model of the acquirer. And valuation is shifting towards staged investments, scenario-based risk pricing, and a much sharper focus on execution capability rather than only on vision. And then, last but not least, jobs will change, leadership determines the outcome. Once again, I respectfully and partly disagree. It's not all about the leaders or their quality. Yes, they have a big impact, even a huge one, but it's also about the people at the other levels. Fundamentally, it's also about us, average consumers, workers, students, and so forth. So let's not be too elitist in our assessments of, for example, the recently concluded or just concluded World Economic Forum in Davos. So, across sessions, one reality was acknowledged openly: job disruption is already happening. Well, that's nothing new in the global economic history. Think about the previous industrial revolutions, including the first one, which began in Britain around 1750. How many millions of people, especially as it progressed across Europe, North America, Asia, and then eventually Oceania, Africa, and Latin America, and the Caribbean, and had even limited impact on the Arctic economies. Not really on the Antarctic economies, because the more relevant um, explorations of the Antarctic only began in the late 19th century. Now, of course, there are tens of research stations across Antarctica. So, how many millions of people had to move, especially on the regularly inhabited continents of the Earth, and particularly in Europe, North America, and gradually in Asia, and then to a limited extent in Africa and Oceania, and then to a somewhat larger extent in Latin America and the Caribbean. Of course, Australia and New Zealand would be the outstanding exceptions to my generalization concerning the industrialization of Oceania. So many people had to move, or chose to move, or both, um, from agriculture, including farming, then from forestry and fishing to manufacturing, and then gradually into services. And then this caused many job disruptions. And then the later industrial revolutions, after the first and second ones, have also caused job disruptions. So this is nothing new. And then there were smaller scale job disruptions already before the first industrial revolution began, particularly in customer service and entry level software rules. At the same time, organizations that actively reskill, redeploy, and involve employees continue to grow. And then, on a closing thought, the question is no longer can we build it, but rather can we lead it responsibly? And I would say, can we apply it responsibly? And can we cooperate responsibly and inclusively during this ongoing economic set of transformations at scale and for real human benefit? Finally, these are our classroom discussion questions for today. One, please define inflation and price indices and discuss their significance as macroeconomic indicators. And then two, please discuss the reasons why the gross domestic product growth is A, desirable, and yet B, debatable in its long term effects on the environment, climate change, and on the Earth's sustainable development. And then, last but not least, this is our homework assignment for today. 1A, please compare the negative effects and the potential positive effects of the inflation rate on the overall national and global economies. Why is the inflation rate such a widely influential macroeconomic indicator? And then 1B, please compare at least 3 or 4 suggested ways for the global economies to achieve a long term balanced and environmentally sustainable economic growth. And in your opinion, which one or ones of those ways is or are the best one or ones to reach this noble economic ideal? And then please give some reasons for your answer. And then, if you're watching, or when you're watching this video, I thank you very, very much for having had enough patience to watch it thus far. I wish you all the best for this weekend and for this coming school week. And I hope to see you again here, or not here, but rather on Google Classroom, and more specifically on Google Meet next Saturday on January the 31st, 2026 from 12:30 p.m. to 3:30 p.m. with that 15-minute or so break roughly in the middle. So starting roughly around 2 p.m. So I'm updating my post. Comment post in the stream section of our Google Classroom page. So there it is, and hopefully we'll meet again then next Saturday in person. Bye bye.